The story centers on Victor Harrington, a wealthy, respected figure whose social standing has long shielded him from accountability, and Amara Cole, a woman whose quiet presence hides discipline, intelligence, and control forged through lived experience. In a high-status public setting, Victor's entitlement turns into public humiliation when he believes his authority has been challenged. What he expects is submission. What he gets is composure and then consequence. Amara's response is not fueled by rage but by precision. Her restraint exposes the fragility of power built on arrogance. What follows is not just a personal reckoning, but a social one, as witnesses and institutions are forced to confront the truth behind influence and respectability. Is a story about dignity, restraint, and the collapse of false authority. The hook immediately tells the audience, this isn't about violence, it's about power being misunderstood. Clear moral contrast, privilege versus humanity. Anticipation of reversal. Emotional irony, the confident man is actually the most vulnerable. Curiosity driven by consequence, not shock. The audience leans in because they sense justice coming, but not how. Victor Harrington had a way of entering a room without ever announcing himself. He didn't need to. The shift happened naturally, like a change in pressure. Conversations softened, laughter recalibrated, bodies angled subtly toward him as though pulled by an invisible current. He didn't look for attention. It arrived on its own, trained by years of knowing exactly who he was and what his name could do. He moved through the space with practiced ease, tailored suit fitting him like a second skin, confidence settling into his posture the way wealth settles into old buildings. Quiet, unquestioned, permanent. People made room without realizing they were doing it. Chairs slid back. Servers adjusted their steps. Even the light seemed to catch on him longer than it did on anyone else. Victor Harrington had built a life where resistance rarely existed. It wasn't arrogance, at least not in his own mind. It was expectation. The world had taught him over decades that his time mattered more. His opinions weighed heavier. His presence carried consequence. Doors opened because they always had. Apologies came before he ever asked for them. Mistakes, when they happened, belonged to someone else. He'd earned it. Or so he believed. The restaurant reflected everything he valued. Exclusivity wrapped in elegance. Soft lighting. Clean lines. The kind of place where menus were leather-bound and prices were spoken with a small pause afterward, just long enough to register importance. This was his terrain. A place where reputation counted for more than manners. He took his seat without looking for approval, already mid-conversation, voice calm and assured. Those around him listened easily, instinctively. He spoke with the casual confidence of someone used to being right, of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Across the room, Amara Cole moved with a different kind of presence. She didn't command attention. She didn't seek it. Her steps were measured, efficient, deliberate in a way that suggested control rather than submission. She had learned long ago how to exist in spaces that weren't designed to notice her, to observe without intruding, to serve without shrinking. She had mastered the art of being underestimated. As she approached his table, she took in the scene with quiet precision. The body language, the subtle hierarchy, the way others leaned toward Victor as if orbiting him. She noted it all without judgment, without curiosity, just awareness. When she spoke, her voice was even, professional, warm without invitation. Victor barely registered her presence. His attention remained fixed on the story he was telling, a polished anecdote delivered with effortless charm. The kind of story designed to remind everyone at the table why his name carried weight. His hand lifted slightly, not to acknowledge her, but to signal interruption, hers, not his. He paused, respectful, patient. That patience, unnoticed and unacknowledged, was the first fracture in the illusion. When he finally looked at her, it wasn't with interest but with mild irritation, as though something out of place had drifted into his field of vision. His gaze skimmed her, catalogued her, dismissed her, all within a breath. He spoke to her the way one speaks to furniture that has been rearranged incorrectly. The shift was subtle, but it was there. A tightening in the room. A small stillness settling in the air, like the moment before a storm chooses its direction. Amara responded calmly, her voice level, her posture unchanged. She offered clarity, not apology. Solutions, not excuses. That somehow unsettled him more. Because she wasn't shrinking. Because she wasn't flustered. Because she didn't seem to understand the rules he'd been living by his entire life. The ones that said she should already be backing away. Around them, conversation slowed. Someone nearby stopped laughing mid-sentence. Another guest glanced over, sensing friction without yet understanding its source. Victor felt something unfamiliar brush against his certainty. A flicker of irritation sharpened into something harder. He straightened slightly, drawing on the authority he'd always relied on. This was his space, his world. And in his world, no one like her challenged him. Not openly, not calmly, not at all. The room waited. And in that waiting, something fundamental began to shift, quietly, irrevocably, toward a moment neither of them could take back. She had learned early that visibility was a double-edged thing. Too much, and people tried to shape you into what they needed. Too little, and they forgot you existed at all. Amara Cole had survived by mastering the space in between, present, capable, and unassuming enough to move freely without invitation. She moved through the room now with that same quiet precision. Her steps were light, not hesitant, simply efficient. Each movement had purpose. She had learned long ago how to read a room before it ever noticed her, how to sense tension before voices rose, how to predict when a smile was about to curdle into something sharper. It wasn't intuition so much as training layered over instinct. She had worked places like this before. Not this exact room, not this level of wealth, but the atmosphere was familiar. Polished surfaces. Soft lighting designed to flatter power. People who mistook comfort for character. She'd learned early that wealth often came with a peculiar blindness, an inability to imagine that someone else might carry weight of a different kind. Amara moved between tables, collecting empty glasses, offering quiet confirmations. She knew the rhythm of service. When to speak, when to wait, when to disappear. She'd mastered that dance not because she lacked confidence, but because attention had a cost she didn't always care to pay. Her calm was often mistaken for submission. It was not. She noticed Victor before he noticed her, not because he stood out, but because everyone else adjusted around him. Chairs angled toward him. Voices softened when he spoke. Even the waitstaff unconsciously cleared his path faster, smoother, like gravity pulled them aside. He carried himself with the ease of someone long accustomed to obedience. When she approached his table, she felt the shift in the air before it fully formed. Tightening. A subtle recalibration of space. She waited, patient, eyes lowered not in deference but in professionalism. She had learned that eye contact at the wrong moment could invite the wrong kind of attention. He spoke without looking at her. His voice steady and confident, layered with assumption. She listened, nodded, responded exactly as required. Clear, courteous, neutral. And yet something in her presence seemed to irritate him. Perhaps it was her stillness. Or the fact that she didn't rush. Or the way she didn't try to soften herself to be pleasing. Whatever it was, it disrupted the invisible hierarchy he depended on. She felt the moment shift, a subtle tightening like a string pulled too far. Her name passed her lips once, calmly, when she introduced herself. It hung there briefly before being ignored. She didn't repeat it. She had learned long ago that forcing recognition from someone who refused to see you was a losing game. Instead, she stood with her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her awareness tuned outward. She registered the way nearby conversations slowed. How a woman 2 tables over glanced up and then looked away. How a server paused mid-step, sensing something about to happen. Victor finally looked directly at her. Not at her face exactly, more at the idea of her. The role he had already assigned. The position he assumed she occupied beneath him. His eyes held a question he didn't bother to ask. Why are you still here? Amara met his gaze evenly. There was no challenge in it. No fear either. Just presence. That unsettled him. He spoke again, sharper this time, his tone clipped, dismissive. It carried the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Around them the air thickened. Even the soft music from the speakers seemed to fade. She answered him calmly, choosing her words with care. She didn't match his edge. She didn't retreat from it either. That balance, that refusal to bend or bristle, struck something in him. A flicker of irritation sparked behind his eyes. The smallest crack in the polished surface. This was not how these interactions went. People like her were meant to absorb discomfort quietly, to apologize, to smooth things over, to disappear. She did none of those things. Instead, she stood there, composed and unyielding, her stillness pressing against the space between them like a held breath. The room seemed to sense it too. Conversations softened. A glass paused mid-lift. The air felt thinner, tighter. Victor shifted his weight, unaware that in doing so, he had already begun to lose control of the moment. Because power, once challenged, even silently, never quite settles back into place. And Amara, standing in the space he thought belonged to him, had just made herself impossible to ignore. The moment didn't announce itself with noise. It arrived quietly, like a shift in pressure, subtle enough that only those paying attention felt it. Victor's patience had thinned. He stood a little straighter now, his posture no longer relaxed but sharpened, as though he were reclaiming space that had somehow been taken from him. His voice carried farther than before, not louder, just edged with a brittle authority that expected obedience. "Excuse me," he said, finally looking directly at her. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you actually going to do your job?" The words landed cleanly, deliberately, designed not just to be heard but to be felt. Amara met his gaze without flinching. Around them conversation ebbed. Few heads turned, then stilled. The air seemed to tighten, compressing the space between them. "I'm here to help," she replied evenly. "If there's something you need, I can." He cut her off with a short laugh that carried no humor. "What I need is competence. Is that too much to ask?" There it was. The line, thin but unmistakable. A murmur rippled nearby. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. Another guest glanced down at their glass, suddenly very interested in the condensation along its rim. Amara inhaled slowly, grounding herself. She'd faced this tone before, the one that tried to shrink her, to pull her inward until she apologized for existing. She felt the familiar instinct to smooth it over, to soften herself into something smaller. But something held her still. She didn't apologize. She didn't step back. "I'm doing my job," she said, her voice steady. "If there's a concern, I can address it." The words were neutral, professional, unremarkable, and somehow that made him angrier. Victor's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck flexed as he leaned forward slightly, invading her space with practiced confidence. "You're not listening," he said, voice low now. "I don't want explanations. I want this done properly." Was heavy, deliberate. Around them, the room felt like it had drawn a collective breath. A woman at the next table glanced toward the exit. A man across the room shifted his chair back an inch, as if instinctively preparing to move. Amara felt the weight of every eye without turning her head. She stood her ground, neither defensive nor confrontational. Her calm was not defiance, it was clarity. "I understand," she said softly. "And I'm telling you I'll take care of it." That was when something in him snapped. His expression hardened, irritation flashing into something sharper. He exhaled through his nose, a sound of disbelief. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said. "People like you always think they're in control." He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. The implication hung heavy in the air, ugly and unmistakable. A hush fell over the room. Amara felt it land, felt the weight of it press into her chest. But she didn't recoil. Instead, she lifted her eyes to his fully now, steady, unflinching. "I'm listening," she said. The restraint in her voice struck a nerve. Victor straightened, his face tightening as if he'd just realized the audience he had. The attention that once empowered him now felt like a spotlight. His tone sharpened, his volume inching upward, each word meant to reclaim control. "I don't have time for this," he snapped. "You're wasting it." He took a step closer. That was when the space between them changed. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. Something shifted in the air, dense and unmistakable. Threshold crossed. Amara didn't move. She didn't retreat. She didn't apologize. She simply held her ground. And in that moment, the room seemed to understand what he did not. This was no longer about service. This was about power. And power, once challenged in public, never returns quietly. The room didn't erupt. Contracted. Sound thinned first. Laughter trailing off mid-breath. The soft clink of glass halted halfway to lips. Even the hum of conversation from the far tables seemed to recede, as if the space itself had drawn inward. What remained was a fragile quiet, stretched tight enough to break. Amara felt it settle over her like pressure against the skin. She didn't move. Neither did Victor. For a brief moment, the two of them existed in a narrow pocket of stillness that felt almost separate from the rest of the room. Everything else blurred. The tables, the polished floors, the muted lights. All that remained was the space between them, charged and waiting. Victor became aware of the attention then. Not admiration, awareness. Eyes lingering. Shoulders angled subtly toward the scene. People who moments earlier had been absorbed in their own conversations were now watching without pretense. It unsettled him. He was used to attention, but this was different. This wasn't admiration or curiosity. It was observation. Valuation. He shifted his weight, attempting to reclaim command of the moment. His posture straightened, chest lifting as if authority could be summoned by posture alone. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, clipped, impatient. "You're standing in my way," he said. "Step aside." The words were simple, but the meaning beneath them wasn't. It wasn't about space. It was about hierarchy. About reminding her where she belonged. Amara looked at him steadily. She didn't flinch. She didn't bristle. She didn't rush to comply or retreat. "I'm not in your way," she replied quietly. "I'm doing my job." Few people nearby exchanged glances. Someone shifted in their chair. A fork scraped against a plate and then stilled. Victor's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked briefly toward the watching faces before snapping back to her. The control he was used to exerting so effortlessly began to slip, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. "Don't make this difficult," he said, lowering his voice as if that would restore dominance. "You don't want to turn this into something it doesn't need to be." The implication hung heavy. Amara felt it settle in her chest. The familiar tension of being cornered by someone who believed escalation belonged to him alone. She took a slow breath, grounding herself. She had learned long ago that fear and anger fed the same fire. She would offer neither. "I'm trying to help," she said again, her tone unchanged. "If you'd like something different, I can." He took a step closer. Not a dramatic lunge. Not an outburst. Just enough to invade the small, careful distance she'd maintained. Enough to remind her that he believed proximity itself was power. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Someone near the bar cleared their throat. Another guest glanced toward the entrance as if considering leaving. No one intervened. Victor's expression hardened. "You really don't know when to stop," he said quietly. "Do you?" The words were soft, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. Amara felt the air shift again, not outward this time but inward. Tightening. A narrowing of possibilities. The moment where choice begins to disappear. She didn't step back. She met his gaze, steady and unblinking, and in that stillness there was no challenge, only resolve. The silence thickened until it seemed to press against every surface in the room. Somewhere a glass clinked. A chair scraped faintly. Someone inhaled too sharply. Victor's hand moved. Not fast. Not yet. Just enough for everyone to see it coming. And in that breath before motion, that thin, suspended instant, the truth settled into the room like gravity. Whatever happened next would not be undone. The balance had already tipped. And the quiet, once merely uncomfortable, had turned dangerous. Time did not slow the way people like to say it did. Narrowed. The room seemed to draw inward, every sound folding into a single, fragile thread. The murmur of voices, the soft music, the distant clink of glass, all of it receded until only the space between them remained. Victor's hand moved. Not fast. Not yet violent. Just deliberate enough to announce intent. A gesture shaped by entitlement rather than anger, by certainty rather than impulse. He believed, utterly, that nothing stood between him and the right to do as he pleased. Amara saw it before anyone else did. She felt the shift in his weight, the subtle change in his balance. She recognized the tension traveling up his arm, the intention settling into muscle before thought could interfere. It wasn't fear that sharpened her focus. It was familiarity, a pattern she had learned long before this room, long before this man. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look surprised. Her body moved with a calm that felt almost detached, as if she were simply adjusting to a change in weather. Victor's hand cut forward, the gesture clumsy in its confidence, fueled by the belief that nothing would stop it. In that same instant, Amara shifted her weight and turned slightly, just enough to let momentum betray him. Her movement was minimal, precise, a redirection rather than a strike. His wrist met her palm, not with a clash but with control. The contact was clean, almost gentle, yet it halted him completely, stopping the motion as if it had run into something immovable. A sharp intake of breath escaped him, not from pain but from surprise. The room seemed to inhale with him. Before his mind could catch up, before outrage or fury could take shape, she moved again. A simple adjustment of position, a subtle shift of balance. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive. And suddenly, Victor was no longer standing the way he had been. The world tilted. He stumbled, his center of gravity betraying him. His own momentum turning against him. A stunned sound left his throat as he reached for stability that was no longer there. He went down. Not violently, not theatrically, but undeniably. The sound his body made against the floor was dull and final, echoing far louder than it should have in the stunned silence that followed. No one spoke. No one moved. Victor lay there, stunned, breath knocked from his lungs. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He tried to push himself up and failed. His body not yet responding to the commands his mind was screaming at it. Amara stood where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady. She hadn't struck him. She hadn't attacked. She had simply ended the moment. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered his name. A chair scraped as someone half stood and then froze, unsure what to do next. Victor drew in a ragged breath, pain flashing across his face as reality settled in. He was on the floor. People were staring. The power he'd worn so comfortably minutes earlier lay scattered around him like broken glass. Amara looked down at him, not with triumph or anger, but with something quieter, almost regretful, as if she had hoped he would choose differently. "I asked you to step back," she said softly. Her voice carried easily in the silence. Not sharp, not raised, simply final. For a long moment no one moved. Then someone near the back reached for their phone. Another followed. The world, it seemed, had resumed breathing. Victor turned his head, his eyes finding hers again. Whatever he saw there made him look away first. Around them, the room slowly began to wake from its shock. Whispers started, tentative at first, then spreading. The spell had broken, but the damage remained. Amara stepped back, creating space. Not retreating, choosing distance. In those 3 seconds, something irreversible had happened. A line had been crossed. A truth had been revealed. And the balance of the room, the unspoken hierarchy everyone had accepted without question, had collapsed. Nothing would be the same after this. Not for him. Not for her. Not for anyone who had witnessed it. The silence didn't break all at once. Fractured. Breath here. Chair scraping there. A murmur that started and stopped as quickly as it began. The room was no longer frozen, but it wasn't free either. It hovered in a strange in-between, caught between what had been and what could no longer be denied. Victor was still on the floor. That fact alone reshaped everything. He tried to rise again, pride pushing before sense, but his body lagged behind his intention. His hand trembled as it pressed against the polished floor. His expression tightening as reality asserted itself. The effort cost him more than he expected. A sharp breath escaped his lips, and this time it wasn't masked by confidence. Someone near the bar took a step forward, then stopped. Another guest leaned back, eyes wide, as if afraid to disturb the scene. A server hovered near the edge of the room, frozen between instinct and instruction. No one rushed to help him. That was the moment the power truly shifted. Victor noticed it too. The hesitation. The pause where deference used to live. He looked around, searching for the familiar signals of allegiance. Sympathy, outrage on his behalf, the unspoken agreement that someone else would fix this for him. They didn't come. Amara stood where she was, her posture relaxed but alert. She didn't loom. She didn't advance. She simply remained present, her calm now the loudest thing in the room. "I didn't want this," she said quietly, her voice steady enough to cut through the murmurs. "You made a choice." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Victor swallowed, his throat working as he tried to regain control of himself and the situation. He pushed up to one knee, then paused, breathing hard. The confidence that had once wrapped him so completely now hung in tatters around him. This is ridiculous," he muttered, the words hollow. "You can't. Do you have any idea who I am?" The question landed flat. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone near the back let out a quiet, incredulous laugh before quickly stifling it. Amara met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly who you are," she said. "That's the problem." Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Victor looked away first. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it carried weight. The room felt it. A subtle but decisive shift. The authority he'd worn so easily moments before now sat awkwardly, like a costume that no longer fit. A staff member approached cautiously, glancing between them. "Sir, are you all right?" Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. His breath came unevenly. He nodded once, stiffly, as though acknowledging the question required more effort than he cared to give. Around them, phones appeared in hands, screens glowing softly. No one was hiding it anymore. The moment had passed the point of discretion. It belonged to everyone now. Amara noticed, but she didn't react. She didn't shield herself or seek the camera. She simply stepped back, giving space, offering an exit without chasing it. "I'm done here," she said, not loudly, not for effect. Just a fact. She turned slightly, angling her body away from Victor, and in doing so made it clear she was no longer part of whatever he was clinging to. That, more than anything else, seemed to break him. He stared after her, chest rising and falling. His expression caught between anger and something dangerously close to realization. For the first time he looked small, not physically but socially, stripped of the armor he had worn without knowing it. The room began to move again. Someone whispered her name. Another person murmured in disbelief. A few eyes followed Amara as she walked away, not with triumph, but with intention. Behind her, the world she left behind scrambled to rearrange itself. Staff moved in. Voices overlapped. Someone called for assistance. The structure that had once revolved so effortlessly around Victor now hesitated, uncertain where to place him. The illusion had cracked. Power, it turned out, wasn't something you owned. It was something others agreed to give you. And in that moment, standing alone, exposed under the weight of 100 watching eyes, Victor Harrington realized that agreement had just been revoked. The room didn't return to normal. Couldn't. What followed wasn't chaos, but something more disorienting. Order trying to reassemble itself after discovering it had been built on a lie. Voices rose in uncertain fragments. Chairs shifted. Someone murmured a question no one answered. The rhythm of the place, once so polished and predictable, stuttered. A manager appeared, breathless, eyes darting between Victor and Amara as if unsure which reality to step into. 2 staff members hovered nearby, their expressions tight with concern, not just for what had happened, but for what it meant. Victor had managed to sit up now, bracing himself against a chair. His face had lost its color, replaced by something brittle and stunned. He looked around, searching for recognition, for affirmation, for someone to reassert the world as he knew it. It didn't come. Instead, phones were raised openly. No one bothered to hide it anymore. The moment had crossed the invisible line between private embarrassment and public reckoning. Amara stood apart from it all, her presence steady amid the quiet storm. She hadn't moved far, just enough to reclaim her space. She watched as the world recalibrated around her, her expression unreadable but composed. A man near the bar whispered, "Did you see that?" Another answered, "He started it." Those words spread faster than outrage ever could. A woman near the window shook her head slowly. Someone else murmured, "She warned him." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The story was already taking shape, and it wasn't the one Victor had always relied on. A manager approached him carefully, voice low and measured. "Sir, we need to make sure you're all right." "Maybe we should." "I'm fine," Victor snapped, though the edge in his voice had dulled. He pushed himself up again, this time managing to stand. The movement was stiff, unsteady. His eyes flicked toward Amara, then away, as if afraid to meet her gaze for too long. He straightened his jacket, a reflex more than a choice. The gesture felt hollow now, stripped of its authority. Someone near the entrance had begun speaking into a phone in a hushed tone. Another guest leaned toward a companion, whispering urgently. The room was no longer a private space. It was a witness. Amara noticed the shift before anyone said it aloud. The balance had changed, not just between her and Victor, but between everyone present and the truth of what they had seen. She felt it in the way eyes followed her now, not with scrutiny, but with recognition. A staff member approached her carefully. Are you okay?" they asked, voice soft. She nodded once. "I'm fine." And she was. Her hands were steady, her breathing slow. Whatever adrenaline had surged through her moments earlier had already settled, leaving clarity in its wake. The manager turned back to Victor. "Sir, we're going to need to ask you to step aside while we sort this out." For a moment it looked like he might protest. His mouth opened then closed. Something in him seemed to recognize the futility of it. The room had already decided. Across the space, eyes followed his every movement, not with admiration but assessment, judgment, memory. Someone whispered, "That's him." Another replied, "I saw the whole thing." Outside, a siren passed in the distance. Not for him, not yet, but it felt like a warning all the same. Amara took a breath and turned away. As she moved toward the exit, the crowd parted without being asked. No one reached for her. No one tried to stop her. Respect, not fear, guided their motion. Behind her, the world continued to rearrange itself. Phones buzzing, voices rising, consequences forming. Ahead of her, the night waited. And as she stepped forward, leaving the noise behind, one truth settled into the room she left behind. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. Changes hands. And everyone who had witnessed that moment would remember exactly when it did. The first headline appeared before dawn. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a few clipped words paired with a grainy still pulled from a phone video. But it traveled fast, slipping through news feeds and private messages with the quiet inevitability of something that could not be undone. By morning, the story had multiplied. Victor woke to the sound of his phone vibrating on the nightstand over and over again, a nervous pulse that wouldn't stop. He reached for it with a groan, head throbbing, body still stiff from the fall. Notifications stacked on the screen in uneven rows. Missed calls, messages, alerts. He ignored most of them, thumb hovering as he scanned the headlines instead. They were not kind. They didn't ask questions or offer benefit of doubt. They didn't frame him as misunderstood or provoked. They showed what had happened. Him advancing, her standing her ground, the moment everything shifted. Over and over again from different angles. Slowed down, zoomed in, paused at the precise instant his confidence cracked. The comments were worse. Some were angry, others were cutting. Many were cold in a way that stung more than outrage ever could. People weren't shocked by what he'd done, they were unsurprised. That realization settled deep. He sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped, staring at a version of himself he didn't recognize. The man on the screen looked smaller, cornered. Suppose. His phone rang again. This time he answered. It was his assistant, her voice tight and professional in a way that made his stomach sink. There had been calls, meetings cancelled. A statement was being drafted, though no one was sure what it should say. The board wanted time. Sponsors wanted distance. The phrase pending review kept surfacing, hollow and ominous. When the call ended, the room felt colder. Across the city, Amara woke to a different kind of noise. Messages, yes, but also silence. A pause in the world that felt deliberate. She sat at her small table, tea cooling untouched, watching sunlight creep across the floor. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She didn't reach for it immediately. She didn't need to. The story had already moved beyond her. When she did check, the messages were varied. Some supportive, some curious, a few intrusive. She ignored most of them. The weight of what had happened still pressed gently against her chest. Not painful, just present. She breathed through it, grounding herself in the simple rhythm of the morning. Outside, the world went on. Inside restaurants, people replayed the footage on loops. At office desks, co-workers whispered. In comment sections, strangers debated who she was, what she must have trained in, where she'd learned to move like that. Some tried to make her into something extraordinary. Others tried to tear her down. She wanted neither. Later that day, Victor sat across from a lawyer who spoke in careful tones. Words like optics and liability floated through the air. The man across from him looked tired, already measuring how much damage control was possible. Public perception matters, the lawyer said gently. Right now, the narrative isn't in your favor. Victor stared at his hands. For the first time he noticed how they shook. The man he'd been, admired, deferred to, unquestioned, felt like a costume he could no longer put back on. Even if the world moved on, something fundamental had shifted. People had seen him as he truly was, stripped of polish and power. And they wouldn't forget. Across town, Amara stepped outside, the air cool against her skin. She moved through the city without being recognized, without fanfare. A woman passing her on the sidewalk met her eyes and gave a small nod. Quiet, understanding. That was enough. She wasn't a symbol. She wasn't a headline. She was simply herself walking forward. Behind her, the world rearranged its stories, its loyalties, its excuses. And ahead of her, the path felt lighter. Not because what had happened was easy, but because it was finally done. The cost of arrogance had been paid. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with truth. The city felt different in the early morning. Not quieter, just softer, as if the noise had learned to give her space. The streetlights were still on, pale halos dissolving against the coming day. Somewhere a delivery truck hummed. A door opened and closed. Life moved forward without ceremony. Amara walked with her hands in her pockets, her pace unhurried. The weight she'd carried for so long had loosened, not vanished but shifted, no longer pressing down on her chest with every breath. She could feel the air again, the way it brushed her skin, the rhythm of her steps matching her heartbeat. Behind her, the story continued to unravel without her permission or participation. It would for a while. She knew that. People would debate it, dissect it, bend it to fit their own arguments. They would argue over motives and meanings, over what she should have done or said or been. None of that belonged to her. What had happened was simple, even if the world insisted on making it complicated. A line had been crossed. She had refused to shrink. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone, including herself, that dignity didn't require permission. She paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change. A woman stood beside her, scrolling through her phone, then glanced up and offered a small smile. Not curious, not reverent, just human. Amara returned it. When the light shifted, she crossed the street. Somewhere behind her, Victor Harrington's name would continue to echo through headlines and conversations, wrapped in speculation and consequence. Meetings would be held. Statements drafted. Doors quietly closed. People who had once spoken his name with admiration would now lower their voices when they said it at all. But that was no longer her concern. She had given enough of herself to that moment. She didn't owe it a future. As she walked, she thought of all the times she'd made herself smaller, of the spaces she'd learned to navigate carefully, of the silence she'd mistaken for safety. She understood now that quiet strength didn't mean erasing yourself. It meant knowing when not to. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. She didn't check it. There would be time for that later if she chose. For now, she let the city carry her forward. Each step felt lighter than the last. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it no longer defined the path ahead. She reached the corner where the morning opened wider, sunlight spilling between buildings, catching on glass and metal and movement. She paused there just long enough to breathe it in. Power, she realized, had never been about control. It was about choice. And she was choosing herself. Without ceremony, without applause, she continued on, unwatched, unburdened, and entirely her own.